In the United States, 4 presidents have been assassinated. The most infamous of these, by far, is the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963 and the rampant conspiracy theories about the event that persist to this day. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln in 1865 at the conclusion of the American Civil War is the other that lives on to this day as a commonly known fact among most Americans. In this video, I want to discuss the 2 lesser-known assassination events, the assassination of James Garfield in 1881 and the assassination of William McKinley in 1901. First, we'll start with James Garfield. President Garfield got his start politically in 1860 when he was elected to the Ohio State Senate as a Republican. Garfield would serve in this position until August of 1861 when he resigned to take a commission as a colonel in the U.S. Army despite no prior military experience. At the time, it was common for volunteer officers like Garfield, who were politically connected, to be appointed commissions. He would rise to the rank of Major General and served at the Battle of Shiloh and the Battle of Chickamauga in 1862 and 1863 respectively. By all accounts, Garfield was an able general. Garfield was elected to the House of Representatives in the 1862 elections and represented Ohio. He was sworn in on March 4, 1863, and due to Congress not meeting until December of 1863, Garfield continued his military service, which led to his presence at Chickamauga in September of that year. Garfield was considered one of the radical Republicans of the era and believed in the total abolishment of slavery in the United States and the extension of civil rights to the newly freed slaves. During his time in Congress, Garfield even published a proof of the Pythagorean theorem in 1876 that bears his name to this day. Garfield would remain in the House until he became president in 1881. At the 1880 Republican Convention, Garfield was not considered as a nominee initially. There were several candidates vying for the nomination, most notably former President Ulysses S. Grant, who was seeking a third non-consecutive term. Grant faced 2 other opponents, John Sherman, the brother of Grant's former comrade William Tecumseh Sherman, and James Blaine, a U.S. representative and former Speaker of the House who would end up being present at Garfield's assassination. The convention remained deadlocked for days, as none of the 3 candidates could garner enough support to be nominated. James Garfield emerged as a compromise candidate that Sherman and Blaine could get behind, and Garfield officially won the nomination on the 36th ballot despite his own protest that he did not want and had not sought the nomination. This contentious Republican convention is important due to the association Garfield's eventual assassin would have with it. Garfield's running mate would be Chester A. Arthur, and together they would win the extremely close 1880 election against General Winfield Scott Hancock, a hero of the Civil War. Garfield won the popular vote by a margin of just over 1,800 votes, the closest in U.S. history, though his Electoral College margin was much larger, winning 214 to 155 over Hancock, with 185 votes needed to win. Some of the closest states by result were California, won by Hancock by 95 votes, New Jersey won by Hancock by 2,000 votes, and most importantly, New York won by Garfield by just over 21,000 votes to secure the presidency. Garfield was sworn in as the 20th president on March 4, 1881. Unfortunately, he ultimately had little time to accomplish much during his presidency. His most notable achievement was the nomination of Stanley Matthews to the Supreme Court in May of 1881. Matthews would serve on the court until his death in 1889. For Garfield, his presidency, and ultimately his life, would be cut short on July 2, 1881, just 4 months into his presidency. First, we need to look at Garfield's assassin, Charles Guiteau. Guiteau was a mentally disturbed man that likely suffered from what we now know as schizophrenia, which caused delusions. He became politically involved in 1872 when he campaigned for Horace Greeley, who was running for president but ultimately lost to Ulysses S. Grant. Guiteau wrongly believed that he would be made the minister to Chile, our modern equivalent of an ambassador. In 1875, Guiteau's own family came to believe he was insane and attempted to have him committed unsuccessfully. Guiteau would later attend the 1880 Republican Convention and write a speech supporting Ulysses S. Grant's nomination. When Garfield was nominated, he changed his speech to support Garfield and distributed copies around the convention. Despite having almost no impact on Garfield's nomination, Guiteau believed that he had been instrumental in getting Garfield nominated and, by extension, elected president. After Garfield's election, he again believed that he should be appointed to a ministerial position in either Vienna, Austria, or Paris, France. He in fact met with Garfield just after Garfield's inauguration to petition for one of these posts. At this time, it was not uncommon for supporters to seek out appointments from the president directly, and many would be awarded for their loyalty with various low-level appointments. I could not find any information regarding how much Garfield knew about Guiteau around this time. Given the large volume of appointments and petitioners that Garfield had met with, it's likely he had no idea who Guiteau was, but I haven't found anything concrete to back up that claim. Ultimately, Guiteau did not receive an appointment despite constant petitioning of prominent Republicans, and decided that he would assassinate Garfield. On July 2, 1881, he would carry out his plan. On that day, President Garfield was with his two sons, Secretary of State James Blaine and Secretary of War Robert Todd Lincoln, the son of President Abraham Lincoln, and they would be at Baltimore Potomac Railroad Station as Garfield was preparing to leave Washington for his summer vacation. While standing in the station's waiting room, Guiteau approached the president from behind and shot him point blank with a .442 British Bulldog revolver. The first shot only grazed Garfield with no serious damage, but the second bullet entered the president's back and lodged behind his pancreas. The wound was not immediately life-threatening, and at the time, there was no security for the president or any type of bodyguard. Guiteau was quickly apprehended, and the president was eventually taken back to the White House to be attended to. The bullet behind his pancreas could not be located by his doctors. Garfield would remain conscious and would in fact live for the next several months. Garfield ultimately succumbed to his wound 79 days after being shot on September 19, 1881. He died from an infection likely caused by the unsanitary examination of his wound by doctors who would often use unwashed and uncovered hands to inspect the wounded area. Between the shooting and his death, Garfield was bedridden and could not perform his duties as president, which were taken over by Vice President Chester A. Arthur, who subsequently became the 21st president upon Garfield's death. Guiteau was ultimately tried and convicted for Garfield's assassination and was executed almost exactly a year after he shot the president. Garfield's assassination is largely forgotten today primarily because of his incredibly short tenure of only a little over 6 months, with 2.5 months of that time spent bedridden and incapacitated due to his wounds from the assassination attempt. This leaves Garfield with very little legacy as a president through no fault of his own. In addition, his successor, Chester A. Arthur, was unremarkable as a president with few significant accomplishments. Arthur would also not seek re-election in 1884, further mitigating James Garfield's legacy to an almost footnote-like existence in American history. It's an incredibly unfortunate end for a man who had not wanted to be president in the first place and arguably could have been a good president given the chance to serve out his term. Now let's move on to William McKinley, the 25th president. Like James Garfield, William McKinley was also from Ohio. Born in 1843, McKinley served in the Civil War and was initially under the command of Major Rutherford B. Hayes, the future 19th president and a man who would end up being a mentor to McKinley. McKinley also served alongside Stanley Matthews, who James Garfield nominated to the Supreme Court. McKinley served in numerous battles during the Civil War, most notably the Battle of Antietam. After the war, McKinley became a lawyer before eventually being elected to the House of Representatives in the 1876 election, while his mentor, Rutherford B. Hayes, was elected president. McKinley would serve as a representative until 1884 when he lost his seat due to gerrymandering before being re-elected that fall and remaining in the House from 1885 to 1891. He then became governor of Ohio in 1892 before running for president in 1896 and winning the presidency handily. McKinley's first term was most notable for the Spanish-American War in 1898. McKinley oversaw the war despite initially not wanting conflict with Spain. Ultimately, the war was widely successful and made McKinley immensely popular as the U.S. gained the territories of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, with the two former remaining U.S. territories to this day. The war saw the U.S. get propelled to the international stage and enter an imperialist stance globally. The war had cost the lives of just under 2,500 Americans. The war also saw the rise in popularity of Teddy Roosevelt, who had served as McKinley's Assistant Secretary of the Navy before resigning to lead the Rough Riders in Cuba during the war. While the war against Spain was still ongoing, McKinley also oversaw the annexation of Hawaii. McKinley therefore oversaw the greatest expansion of U.S. territory in decades. In 1900, McKinley also signed the Gold Standard Act, which put the U.S. on the gold standard, which would ultimately last until 1971, when it was finally ended permanently. McKinley also oversaw the diplomatic groundwork for what ultimately resulted in the Panama Canal. McKinley ultimately ran for re-election in 1900. His original vice president was Garrett Hobart, who had died in 1899 and had not been replaced, as it was normal prior to the 25th Amendment to wait until the next election to elect a new vice president. Instead, the governor of New York and Spanish-American war hero, Teddy Roosevelt, was nominated to be McKinley's running mate. Roosevelt was a very popular and very progressive Republican, and he was nominated to the vice presidency as a way to dead-end his political career. The vice presidency was considered unimportant at the time and more symbolic at most. At the time, only John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and Martin Van Buren had been elected president after having served as vice president and not having taken office after the death of a president. The McKinley-Roosevelt ticket would win the election handily. Now to McKinley's assassination. In September of 1901, just 6 months into his second term, McKinley was in Buffalo, New York for a presidential visit to the Pan American Exposition, a World's Fair type event. On September 6, McKinley entered the Temple of Music at the exposition for a reception being held in his honor. The building was packed, and McKinley prepared to shake hands with those who had waited to meet him. There was a large police presence, as well as 3 Secret Service agents present, but none detected McKinley's assassin. McKinley's assassin was a man named Leon Czolgosz. Czolgosz was a self-proclaimed anarchist. It's believed that he was likely inspired by the assassination of King Umberto I of Italy in July of 1900. Umberto's assassin was also an anarchist. Czolgosz had gotten in line to meet the president like dozens of others and had concealed a .32 caliber revolver under a handkerchief. Czolgosz waited in line as McKinley shook hands with dozens of people before approaching the president. With Czolgosz's right hand occupied by the revolver that was covered with the handkerchief, President McKinley reached for his left hand. As McKinley grasped his hand, Czolgosz fired 2 shots into McKinley's abdomen. One bullet deflected off a button, and the other entered McKinley's abdomen. Czolgosz was quickly tackled and began to be beaten by bystanders and police until the wounded McKinley ordered it to stop. Czolgosz was apprehended and McKinley was rushed to the hospital. A surgery was done that failed to find the bullet that had penetrated the president, but some of the damage was able to be repaired. McKinley was taken to a nearby house to recover and was alert and oriented at this time. Unfortunately, 8 days later, President McKinley succumbed to his injuries secondary to an infection. Vice President Roosevelt was then sworn in as the 26th president. Leon Czolgosz was subsequently charged, tried, and convicted for the president's murder and was executed on October 29, 1901, barely 6 weeks after McKinley's death. McKinley died as an immensely popular president. His assassination is more remembered than James Garfield's, but also remains secondary to Lincoln and Kennedy's in the American conscience. His assassination arguably was the second most consequential in U.S. history, with Lincoln's being first due to the actions of his successor, Teddy Roosevelt. Roosevelt had a presidency whose legacy persists to this day. Roosevelt brought forward dozens of antitrust lawsuits to break up monopolies, created the Food and Drug Administration, created the United States Forest Service, preserved 150 million acres of forest, started the National Park System, helped negotiate the end of the Russo-Japanese War, and had overseen the construction of the Panama Canal, to just name a few. It's hard to say whether or not Roosevelt would have been able to win an election outright, or whether the tragic death of McKinley was the only chance he would ever get to be president. Roosevelt would also find himself on the receiving end of an assassin's bullet in 1912 when he was running for a third non-consecutive term as president. Fortunately, he would survive with his brush with death. McKinley's assassination also led to the Secret Service being formally tasked with the protection of the president as well as other dignitaries and VIPs. I hope you found this video informative, and if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and I'll see you on the next one.